Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Beneath the peace of a secluded mountain home, something was moving. Secret tunnels, eerie footsteps, and a smiling HOA with too many secrets. When freedom meets obsession, one man uncovers a hidden network built to watch, manipulate, and control. The truth lies underground. I'd been dreaming of this moment for over a decade. Not just the moving-in day, though I'll admit, seeing the last of the cardboard boxes stacked neatly in the corner of the freshly painted living room brought a real sense of arrival, but of everything that led up to it. The land, the house, the view. It was mine, all mine. A secluded mountain lot in Colorado nestled just outside of the Aspen Trails North subdivision, but legally and, more importantly, contractually, outside of the Homeowners Association's reach. That was the point. That was the entire point. The parcel had been pulled out of the HOA grid by the previous owner back in 2017. I had the papers to prove it, notarized and recorded with the county. No dues, no color charts for my front door, no letters about overgrown native shrubs, just forest, clean air, and the freedom to build the damn house I'd spent years designing in my sketchbooks. Of course, life had its own opinions. Between the pandemic, contractor shortages, and the delightful surprise of inflation, the house didn't rise overnight. It took nearly 2 years from purchase to move in. I lost count of how many months we waited for the concrete foundation to get poured. Weather delays, supply chain issues, you name it. When the crew finally arrived, they muttered about soft spots in the soil, especially around the rear third of the lot. One of them even joked about buried treasure. I just shrugged. Mountain soil was unpredictable. I signed the inspection papers, and they kept digging. By the time we finally moved in, me and Juliana, my partner of 6 years, the whole property had the fresh scent of cut pine and paint. We spent our first week walking barefoot across the hardwood, marveling at how quiet it was. No traffic, no leaf blowers, just birds, wind, and the occasional deer staring through the kitchen window like he was judging our furniture choices. It felt perfect. The neighbors, when they did show up, were polite in that Stepford kind of way. No casseroles or awkward welcome committees, but there were some waves from driveways, some cautious, let us know if you need anything moments. Fine by me. I wasn't looking for friendship, I was looking for peace. And yet, something didn't sit right from the start. Maybe it was the way one of the HOA board members, guy named Terry, if I'm remembering right, came over with this weird grin and a clipboard. Just checking on setbacks and grading, he said, like that made any sense outside their jurisdiction. I politely told him I was exempt. His smile twitched. Oh, that's what the last guy said too. Weird, but okay. Then there was the thing I found tucked under a bag of topsoil near the tool shed. A crumpled inspection form, HOA letterhead, dated just a few months before we broke ground. It had my parcel number handwritten, but the name was some bastardization of Lawson. Lowen, maybe. The kicker? It included a notation about underground utility access path confirmed. That made my eyebrow twitch. I'd never requested any such thing, and no utility crew had been scheduled during that time. The power, internet, and water hookups were all routed in full daylight, clearly documented in my permits. I called Juliana over, and we both stared at it in the afternoon sun. "You think someone else is poking around here?" she asked. I didn't answer. I was too busy wondering how they had the parcel number correct, but not the name. Still, I tried to let it go. It wasn't enough to raise alarms. Maybe it was an administrative fluke, someone mixing up paperwork. HOA types weren't known for being tech-savvy. Then came the uninvited drop-ins. Neighbors from the other side of the invisible HOA border would stroll by while I was working on the deck, asking questions that felt off. One woman complimented our choice of tile for the bathroom. Odd, since the bathroom had no windows. Another asked if we'd considered repainting the back wall, since it didn't match the neighborhood palette. There was no neighborhood palette where we lived. I kept telling myself they were just nosy. Maybe they'd seen something through the open door. Maybe they'd been watching when we moved in. Maybe. But by the end of our second month in the house, I started sleeping lighter. I'd wake up to faint thuds I chalked up to raccoons, pipes settling, wind, all the usual suspects. And yet, I kept noticing dust on the baseboards in weird patterns. Not random, almost like faint footprints. Juliana caught me one night crouched by the laundry room vent with a flashlight. She didn't even ask. Just handed me coffee and joined me on the floor. I should have felt paranoid. Instead, I started feeling watched. It started with a low hum. Not the kind you hear and instantly recognize, but the kind that lives just below your awareness, like the feeling of being watched through a keyhole. The first few nights I ignored it, chalked it up to the wind sliding through pine branches or the old ductwork settling into its new reality. But by the fifth night in a row, I was wide awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the floorboards under our bed like they were trying to tell me something. Juliana heard it too. She didn't say anything for a while. She's got this methodical, scientific calm about her. But one morning, over coffee, she casually asked, "Do we have any crawlspace access under the bedroom?" We didn't. The design was slab-on grade. I'd drawn it myself. There wasn't supposed to be anything under the bedroom besides compacted soil and concrete. But there was that sound again the next night. Steady, soft, rhythmic. Not pipes. Not air. Footsteps. That same week, I started getting visits from a particularly chipper man named Brent. Said he was on the Architectural Review Committee of Aspen Trails North, which was hilarious because my property wasn't subject to their review. He brought muffins and a laminated pamphlet about community visual harmony. I accepted the muffins, smiled like a man pretending not to be insulted, and reminded him, politely but firmly, that we weren't under HOA jurisdiction. Brent chuckled like I told a joke he didn't understand. Sure, he said. But you know, some of your siding doesn't quite match the rear elevation standards. Just thought I'd mention it. The community appreciates cohesion. The only reason he knew what the back of my house looked like was if he'd seen it up close. Too close. I kept my cool. But after I closed the door, I stood there for a long minute, muffins in one hand, the pamphlet in the other, and started to feel the creeping sensation of a trap being slowly pulled shut. It wasn't just Brent. 2 days later, a woman in yoga pants and mirrored sunglasses walked by with her golden retriever and stopped to compliment the rear-facing window in our master bathroom. That window didn't exist. Juliana had insisted we keep it private. The only opening in that bathroom was a vented slit near the ceiling. The only way anyone could know there'd been any work done back there was if they'd been inside or underneath. She caught my expression as we sat on the porch that evening, sipping drinks as the sunset licked across the peaks. "You're doing the thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The I'm solving an unsolvable problem in my head thing." Eyebrows all tight, I ran a hand over my face. They knew about the bathroom and about the siding. They're watching us. She didn't flinch, just nodded slowly. I heard them again last night, same time, footsteps. My stomach twisted. "You sure?" I got up and put my ear to the floor. It was someone pacing. Not animals, not creaks. Steps. Light, deliberate. Like someone who's trying not to be heard and doesn't realize I can still hear them. We stopped joking after that. I started inspecting the entire perimeter, every vent, every pipe, every inch of slab that might have been tampered with. Most of it was clean. Normal. Until I crawled behind the water heater closet and noticed that one of the vent covers in the wall didn't quite match the screws I used during the build. The metal was newer, the screws weren't rusted, and the dust around it was disturbed. Juliana and I agreed not to touch it. Not yet. I wanted data. Evidence. A hunch wouldn't do me any good if I ended up accusing the HOA of tunneling under my property, and they laughed me out of court, or worse, countersued for defamation. That night, I dug out my old acoustic sensors from a freelance project I did years back, residential noise mapping for high-end green homes. I set them up along the interior floor in 3 rooms and ran an audio logger through my laptop. I tried not to think about how much effort I was putting into solving something that technically didn't exist. The results came back after 3 days. Every night, between 2:45 and 3:15, someone or something moved beneath our house. Slow movement, 10 to 12-foot pacing intervals, human cadence. We didn't speak much that next morning. We just looked at each other and knew what came next. But the tipping point came when Juliana, ever the biologist, decided to run a simple test. She left a vial of phosphorescent powder, luminous at night and impossible to clean without water, inside the HVAC access where that strange vent cover sat. The next day, the powder was smeared. Worse, it was smeared from the inside out. And that same afternoon, as I was hauling lumber around to extend the garden beds, I heard a man across the fence tell another, in a low, amused voice, if he only knew what's underneath. I turned around, but they were already walking away. To HOA. Folks, I recognize them from Brent's Muffin Parade. One of them caught my glance and waved. Friendly. Too friendly. There's a particular kind of clarity that only arrives at 3 in the morning, hunched over a laptop, replaying audio loops of ghost footsteps under your house. I sat in the dim light of my office, sweat drying on the back of my neck, listening to the pattern again and again. It was always the same. Soft step, pause, shift, repeat. The pacing was almost meditative, like someone waiting for a signal. Not an animal, not a machine, a person. That was the moment I stopped wondering if something was under the house and started asking how deep. I called an old friend from college, Elliot, a geotechnical engineer who owed me a favor after I bailed him out of a botched permitting job in Arizona. He was intrigued the moment I said the words, possible subsurface anomaly under a residential slab. A week later, his team rolled up with ground-penetrating radar equipment, sensors, and that same, this better be worth my weekend, look engineers. Always wear when a civilian calls in a hunch. We scanned the entire underside of the property over the course of 4 hours, dragging sleds and antennas over every inch of concrete, watching the waveform spikes and void signatures roll across the monitor. And then we saw it. Roughly 5 feet beneath the rear third of the house, stretching eastward in a long, slightly arcing line toward the neighboring HOA district, was a rectangular negative space. Concrete walls based on the density readout. Approximately 4 feet in height, maybe 3 in width. Consistent depth the entire way. A tunnel. I've seen service corridors, Elliot muttered, pointing at the image. But this wasn't built by a utility company. No piping. No thermal lines. No registration tags. That's a private build. Illegal? I asked. If it crosses property lines without consent, absolutely. If it passes under your slab, it's a violation of easement law and property rights. And if someone's using it without disclosure, he tapped the screen. That's trespass minimum. Felony if there's surveillance involved. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Juliana. The next day, I tore up the floor in our supply closet. It wasn't a large space, maybe 4 by 6, wedged between the laundry room and kitchen pantry. I'd always meant to install built-in shelving there. Now I was installing history. Beneath the laminate floorboards, past the insulation panel and a suspiciously shallow crawl void, I found it. A vent grate, not mine. Embedded directly into the concrete slab, its edges sealed with some kind of industrial epoxy, painted to match the surrounding floor. My pulse was in my ears. I pulled the grate free, and there it was. A narrow tunnel lined with smooth, gray concrete, barely lit by thin LED strips strung along the ceiling like Christmas lights. Wiring ran alongside the left wall, zip-tied neatly, disappearing into shadow. Mounted every few feet were black motion sensors, and further down, what looked unmistakably like a Wi-Fi repeater. The air was cold, dry, mechanical. Juliana stood above me, flashlight trained on my back. You going down there? I looked at her. You going to stop me? She sighed, handed me the flashlight, and clipped the GoPro to my shirt. Don't do anything heroic. Just document. I slid into the passage like I'd rehearsed it in a dream. The space was barely tall enough to crouch. It wasn't a makeshift crawl space. It was engineered. Every few feet, I passed small steel plates bolted into the concrete, marked with alphanumeric codes like B17 and SVC-P2. I recorded everything. The motion sensors flicked red as I passed. One beeped softly. 15 feet in, I found the first side tunnel, a narrow branch terminating at what looked like a sealed steel panel. I knocked. It rang hollow. Another 100 feet, and the main corridor curved gently to the right, toward the border of the HOA district. And that's when I saw it. A metal access door, half open. Beyond it, a softly humming room filled with equipment racks. Blinking LEDs, Ethernet cables, cooling fans, a goddamn server room. In a tunnel, under my house. I didn't go in. Instead, I backed out slowly, made my way home, and resealed the grate. Poorly, but enough to pass a quick glance. Then I spent the rest of the night watching the tunnel cam feed from my laptop, drinking black coffee and waiting to see if anyone noticed. Nothing. No movement. But the logs showed that between 2:47 and 3:06 that morning, the motion sensors had been tripped. Twice. Meaning someone had passed through the tunnel after I left. Probably from the HOA side. I copied all the video. I backed it up to 3 drives. I hid one in Juliana's sock drawer, one in my toolbox, and one in a safety deposit box in town, because now I knew. This wasn't a theory. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't raccoons, HVAC, or mountain superstition. They were under my house. I didn't want to call the cops. Not at first. Something about telling a sheriff's deputy that your neighbors built a secret surveillance tunnel under your home makes you hesitate. It sounds insane, even when it's true. Even when you have the videos, the GPR scans, the stolen vent cover, the Wi-Fi signals logged by your laptop. It's just the kind of story that lands you on some HOA watch list, or worse, a conspiracy subreddit. But I called them anyway. Deputy Avery was the one who showed up. Mid-40s, clean uniform, polite tone, dead eyes. I walked him through it slowly, starting with the sounds, then the sensors, the video, the tunnel. He nodded along like he'd already decided I was half nuts but was too tired to fight it. "So, you're saying," he said at last, "that your neighbors built a tunnel under your house to spy on you?" "I'm saying they built it before this house was even here," I corrected. "It was already in place. I built over it without knowing." "That makes it trespassing and unauthorized construction." He raised an eyebrow. "And you have proof." I handed him the USB stick. "Scans, footage, date stamped. You can verify the path leads to property controlled by the Aspen Trails North HOA." He looked at the stick like it might bite him, then reluctantly slid it into his vest pocket. "All right, I'll file a report. Might take a few days." It didn't. 2 days later, he called me back. Said he'd shown the footage to someone higher up the ladder. That afternoon, an unmarked county vehicle rolled into my driveway and 3 people got out. 2 wore plain clothes and badges on lanyards. The third was a woman in a crisp gray suit. No badge, but definitely in charge. "We'd like to verify the tunnel," she said, flashing a warrant. "And check the eastern exit." Juliana watched from the porch as we led them through the house and into the supply closet. When I peeled back the floorboards and showed them the vent, there was a moment, brief but visible, when even the suited woman blinked. "This is not standard construction," she said. "No kidding," I muttered. They entered the tunnel. I didn't go with them. I just waited in the living room with Juliana, both of us tense as hell, pretending to sip lukewarm coffee. 30 minutes later, they came back up, quieter than before. "We're securing the other end," one of them said. "What's over there?" I asked. "Your neighbor's clubhouse." Aspen Trails North's Community Resource Center, a sterile-looking building with tinted windows and laughably secure doors. I'd always thought it was just where they held bake sales and passive-aggressive board meetings. Turned out it had a reinforced basement, a server room, and a second tunnel entrance, disguised as a maintenance hatch, hidden behind a locked cabinet. By sunset, the county had taped off both ends of the tunnel and pulled in a mobile command unit. I watched them haul out crates of equipment, hard drives, power inverters, camera mounts, evidence bags. Then came the real bombshell. 4 more tunnel access points were discovered, one under an elderly couple's garage, one beneath a short-term rental that had coincidentally been owned by a former HOA board member, and 2 others on parcels just outside the HOA border, like mine. None of the homeowners had consented to anything of the sort. It was a goddamn network. A spiderweb of quiet surveillance tunnels built beneath properties that didn't conform. Outsiders, free thinkers, exceptions, people who, like me, had bought land outside the HOA's grip. When they cracked the server room, they found more than just video. There were audio logs, transcripts, motion heat maps. They even had internal layouts of homes, ours included, accurate to within inches. Someone had blueprinted my house from the inside, even though I'd never shared the final plans with anyone but the city. Then came the paperwork. The officers pulled boxes of printed documents with HOA letterhead, signatures, stamps, official-looking but riddled with problems, fake department names, unregistered permit numbers, and a series of maps labeled zoning expansion plans, marking homes like mine as provisional compliance targets. On every map, our property was coded in red, with a note in the margin, "Underground servicing route confirmed, access preserved." Each document bore the same signature, Karen Brady, HOA president. When I saw her name, I nearly laughed. Of course it was Karen. It was always Karen. Courtrooms smell like stress and pine-scented floor wax. I'd never spent much time in one until that spring, but after weeks of depositions, filings, and legal gymnastics, I could tell you which judge preferred black coffee, which bailiff carried a flask, and which seat had the least uncomfortable cushion. My lawyer, Ruben Torres, was a meticulous bastard in the best way. former real estate litigator turned property rights pitbull. He'd taken one look at the tunnel footage and said, "Oh, they're screwed, deeply, creatively, and legally." But screwing them wasn't going to be simple. See, Karen Brady didn't just dig tunnels and wire up spy cams. She played the long game, the bureaucratic game, the kind where you don't forge documents, you resurrect old ones. One of the first things their legal team presented was a packet of archival permits, city records no less, dated back to 2015. It looked official. Permits for subsurface utility corridors filed under an HOA infrastructure improvement grant. Thing is, those permits had been legally terminated in 2016 when the county reclassified several parcels, including mine, as independent residential. But someone had filed a request to reinstate the permits using an obscure provision that allowed for reactivation of dormant service rights if they were part of a pre-existing infrastructure plan. Guess who signed the reinstatement? Karen. And the kicker? She hadn't forged anything. She created a fictitious subcommittee, Engineering Compliance Division, and used that to file everything through city clerks who didn't know any better. Paper trail. Impeccable. Intention. Malicious as hell. Reuben called it a legal Trojan horse, but we had our own cavalry. The tunnel, the sensors, the heat maps, the invasive surveillance, it all spoke louder than a dusty permit. Especially once the forensic team confirmed that our tunnel wasn't built to carry utilities at all. No conduit, no drainage, no fiber optic, just concrete, cables, and control. The courtroom buzzed like a hornet's nest when the evidence was presented. We weren't the only plaintiffs anymore. 3 other homeowners joined the case after discovering similar tunnels under or near their property. The judge allowed us to consolidate the lawsuits. Now it was Lawson versus Aspen Trails North HOA et al. Karen naturally didn't show up in person at first. Her lawyer, some puffed-up contract law guy named Glenn, claimed she was under mental distress and couldn't attend. When she finally appeared, she wore a beige pantsuit and that stiff plastic smile of someone who's used to being obeyed. She insisted the tunnels were infrastructure access pathways and claimed she had reasonable belief that the properties in question were still under provisional HOA jurisdiction. Her voice trembled just enough to suggest victimhood, but her eyes betrayed the lie. Reuben eviscerated her during cross, especially when he presented the zoning maps with misaligned coordinates. On the stand, a county cartographer explained that Karen had inadvertently used parcel IDs from before the 2017 redistricting. That mistake conveniently put my land back under HOA oversight, on paper at least. Inadvertent, my ass, I muttered to Juliana. Karen claimed it was an honest clerical error. The judge didn't look convinced. Things got real spicy when the county prosecutor stepped in and announced an independent criminal investigation. Charges were being prepared for trespassing, invasion of privacy, and falsification of official records. Not forgery technically, but intentional misuse of public documents. That wiped the smug off Glenn's face. As discovery continued, we found more. HOA meeting minutes, never published, where Karen discussed containment of non-participating homeowners and expanding strategic oversight through indirect integration. Those were her words, her handwriting, her initials. The HOA board, now desperate to distance themselves, began resigning en masse. Brent, the muffin man from earlier, actually testified against her, said she had gone rogue, claimed he was just there for the coffee budget. The courtroom grew more crowded with every hearing. Local reporters started sniffing around. A blog popped up tracking the case. Juliana suspected one of the other plaintiffs was behind it. We started getting emails from people in other states. Hey, my HOA's acting weird too. Can you check if they're tunneling under our homes? I started to understand we'd hit something deeper than one woman's obsession with control. Karen had played with the rulebook until she bent the world around her, and when the cracks formed, she tried to fill them with concrete and secrecy. But we were cracking it wide open. Karen Brady was finished. Or so I thought. The hearings had turned ugly, her legal defenses were cracking, and the HOA was bleeding board members like a sinking ship. The press had caught wind of the tunnel network and started calling it the Suburban Stasi. I was contacted by a documentary crew from Denver. A few of the other plaintiffs were already planning a podcast series. Then, out of nowhere, Karen surrendered. It came on a Monday morning, overcast, windless, the kind of quiet day that feels like it's saving its breath. Reuben called and said, "Check your inbox." I opened the email and stared at it for a good 10 seconds before I could even process the subject line. Public Statement of Resignation and Apology, Karen Brady, Aspen Trails North HOA. It was real, a PDF notarized, addressed to the entire HOA membership, the county, the court, and, specifically, to me. She accepted full responsibility for unauthorized infrastructural overreach, admitted to overzealous zoning integration efforts, and even referenced the tunnel as a regrettable and misguided extension of communal surveillance standards. It read like something a PR firm had spent 2 weeks polishing. The apology was just vague enough to avoid true culpability, but official enough to satisfy the press. Karen announced her immediate resignation and said she would withdraw from all HOA activity and future legal engagement in order to reflect on the damage caused. She even offered me compensation, an initial settlement offer of $250,000 framed as property distress relief. It felt anticlimactic. I wanted to feel triumphant. I didn't. Juliana didn't buy it for a second. Too neat, she said, scrolling through the statement on her tablet. Too fast. She's pulling a play. I wanted to believe we'd won. We were tired, mentally, emotionally, legally. But that night, something gnawed at me. The statement hadn't mentioned the server room, or the surveillance data, or the fact that we still hadn't located all tunnel exits, so I stayed up. Just like before, only this time the tunnel cam feed was dark, dead, no signal. I checked the motion logs. Nothing for the last 48 hours. That was odd. Even inactive, those sensors should have triggered ambient ticks, air shifts, dust, insects. I refreshed the data again. Still nothing. I felt that cold chill, like someone had erased a line from your map. The next morning, I went back down. I lifted the floorboards in the supply closet and opened the grate. What I found made my stomach drop. The tunnel was filled with gravel, crushed stone, cinder dust, and somewhere beneath it all, concrete. A fresh pour, already set. Karen hadn't just walked away. She'd buried everything. Juliana ran diagnostics on our backups. Thankfully, the video and data were still intact on the drives we'd stored off-site. But forensics? Gone. No way to analyze entry points. No fingerprints. No serials on devices. Just a sealed tomb under our feet. Rubin filed an emergency injunction to halt any destruction of potential evidence. Too late. When the court convened again, Karen wasn't there. Her lawyer presented a letter stating she was undergoing mental health evaluation and would no longer participate directly in the proceedings. The board issued a motion to dissolve the HOA entirely, claiming the organization had been compromised beyond repair. It felt like a win, but it didn't taste like one. We'd exposed the tunnel. We'd dragged it into daylight. But Karen had shut the lid, locked it, and thrown away the key. On her terms. I spent the next few days digging through old footage, matching timestamps, searching for anything we missed. And that's when I found it. One video. One frame. A time-stamped image from the night before the gravel fill. Karen, in the tunnel, alone, wearing gloves and coveralls, a hard hat standing beside a stack of sealed metal crates. I zoomed in. On the wall behind her, a map, hand-drawn, with marks leading far beyond the HOA boundary. That's when I realized she hadn't just buried the tunnel. She'd buried part of the truth. And maybe, just maybe, left a second network undiscovered. There's a special kind of rage that comes from being played by someone you've already beaten. I should have felt relief. Karen was out, the HOA had collapsed, and the press was calling me a hero for standing up to suburban authoritarianism. But I didn't care about headlines or hashtags. I cared about the fact that she'd gotten the last move, and maybe more than one. I couldn't get that frame out of my head. Karen standing in the tunnel, a map taped to the wall behind her. She'd been deliberate. She'd taken time to pose that photo, to record herself destroying everything. And that hand-drawn map. It wasn't just for routing the tunnels we already knew about. It included areas outside the original HOA zone, farther east. Into private lands that had no reason to be involved, Juliana and I started digging, figuratively this time. We pulled old property tax records, municipal infrastructure requests, zoning appeals. We found discrepancies, small ones, on 5 other parcels within a mile radius of ours. Each showed inactive utility corridors listed in their plat descriptions, even though those areas had no history of underground access. We compiled the data and sent it to the county investigator handling the case. He seemed skeptical at first, until he ran a quick thermal drone scan over one of the flagged lots and spotted what he called a temperature anomaly consistent with subterranean cavity structures. In layman's terms, another tunnel. The county came back in force, this time with full excavation crews, warrants for every adjacent property with unexplained subterranean activity, and even a pair of federal observers, Department of Housing and Urban Development, which raised more questions than it answered. When they dug up the access hatch behind the HOA clubhouse, sealed and paved over just days earlier, they found the server room had been moved, stripped of data, but someone had left a backplate loose. Behind it, a flash drive, encrypted. It took 3 days to break. What we found wasn't just surveillance, it was strategy. A full plan to expand the HOA by stealth, tunneling beneath selected lots, installing hidden devices, collecting behavioral data, and using it to coerce homeowners into joining. Karen had created psychological profiles targeting difficult residents with tailored pressure campaigns, noise complaints, city code citations, anonymous threats. She called it the soft compliance matrix. I called it psychotic. And we weren't the only victims. The flash drive contained profiles on at least 23 other homeowners, most of whom had no idea they were ever targeted. Some had mysteriously decided to voluntarily join the HOA after months of unexplained disruptions in their daily life. Others had sold and moved away. It was control, not through force, but through manipulation. And it worked. That's when the FBI got involved. Turns out Karen had used HOA funds, dues paid by actual members, to finance the tunnel construction. She routed the payments through fake landscaping contracts and infrastructure assessments that no one ever questioned. Over the years, she'd siphoned nearly $1.4 million into her personal LLC, which she named Serenity Solutions. The name alone made me want to punch drywall. The fallout was instant. Karen was issued a federal warrant and arrested at her sister's ranch in Wyoming, trying to burn documents in a rusted fire pit. The footage made the local news. Her in a bathrobe yelling about neighborhood purity, while agents in windbreakers dragged her into a black SUV. The court froze all HOA assets. The community center was sealed and marked for demolition. The tunnels, every known one, were filled with rebar and concrete. The state began drafting legislation on what they called unauthorized subterranean encroachment. I didn't celebrate. I poured myself a drink and stared at the hole in my closet floor. They'd missed one tunnel, the one under my house. I hadn't let them seal it. Not yet. Instead, I installed a pressure sensor grid, biometric scanner, and a redundant surveillance net with 3 separate offline storage backups. I wasn't paranoid. I was ready. Because if Karen Brady had taught me anything, it was that people like her never stop digging. It was early fall by the time things settled. The aspens were just starting to turn gold, their leaves rattling in the breeze like the bones of an old secret. For the first time in months, the mountain felt quiet again. Honestly quiet, not the brittle silence that follows a threat. I could breathe, but the damage was still everywhere, just under the surface. And I mean that literally. I let them fill the other tunnels, let the county bring in crews with rebar, industrial sealants, and concrete trucks that choked up our narrow road for weeks. Juliana and I stood in the driveway, watching the last section get poured under the HOA's former clubhouse, a tombstone for a control system disguised as community service. But the tunnel under my house, I kept it, not because I wanted it. Hell, I hated the damn thing. But I didn't trust that this was truly over. Karen had been thorough, but also clever. She'd faked a surrender once. She could have buried deeper secrets, maybe physical, maybe digital. That tunnel might still hold something I'd missed. So I converted it. I ran lighting, reinforced the entry point with a steel hatch, added motion-triggered alarms and biometric locks. It wasn't just a crawl space anymore. It was a bunker. A monument to the paranoia she built, and, weirdly, a symbol of my freedom. I also had it surveyed and officially transferred to my property. Thanks to a successful civil suit, the HOA's remaining assets were liquidated, and I was awarded full rights to the subterranean corridor beneath my lot, plus $1.8 million in damages. Juliana used part of it to build a greenhouse. She called it poetic justice, reclaiming stolen ground to grow something honest. The legal ripple effects were wild. Over a dozen other HOAs across the state were audited. A few were disbanded entirely. One HOA president in Boulder got caught trying to cover up unauthorized camera installations in street lamps. Turns out Karen wasn't the only one with a God complex and a zoning map. A new state law passed in the Colorado legislature, the Subsurface Privacy and Property Act. The papers nicknamed it Karen's Law. It guaranteed that any underground structure passing beneath private residential land without explicit consent was a felony, no exceptions. Funny how fast politicians move when the word surveillance gets attached to suburbia. As for Karen, she was convicted on 6 felony counts: trespass, fraud, document manipulation, conspiracy, misuse of municipal resources, and destruction of evidence. She got 8 years, eligible for parole in 4. I got a letter from her, typed. No return address, just a P.O. box in Cheyenne. It read, "You mistook order for malice. All I ever wanted was harmony. You refused it." So I adjusted. I burned the letter in the fire pit behind the house, watched the ashes rise over the tree line. Juliana and I finally finished building the back veranda, one of the few parts of the house that never sat above the tunnel. We drink our coffee there now, most mornings. Sometimes we sit in silence. Sometimes we talk about selling the story, people still ask, but I always say no. This isn't entertainment, it's a scar. Still, I did put up a sign at the end of the drive, wooden, hand-carved, just 5 words, private property, no tunnels, no Karens.